Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Master God Diviner stared at Bai Xiaochun, his mind reeling, almost unable to believe how events were unfolding. However, he could believe it, no matter how much he didn't want to. He was currently teetering on the verge of passing out, and all he could think about were the grand aspirations he had harbored upon leaving Bai Xiaochun's spirit abode all those months ago, and also Bai Xiaochun's voice calling out to him as he left. Back then, he had been absolutely certain that he had made the right decision. Now, though, it felt like the world was playing a cruel joke on him. That was especially the case when Bai Xiaochun said, "You have it way worse than me." That caused tears to instantly well up in Master God Diviner's eyes. There Bai Xiaochun was, glittering with the light of magical treasures, his face glowing with a healthy sheen, riding a huge crocodile. He didn't seem to have things bad at all, and it caused Master God Diviner's heart to fill with an intense sensation of injustice. The past few months had been very difficult. Few people believed the divinations he performed, and he had even gotten into some disputes with customers. At first, he hadn't worried about that, but as more and more people got angry with him, he had been forced to flee in terror from the East District. Eventually, he ended up in the North District, where he managed to get back on his feet to some extent. Unfortunately, his income was scanty, and he ended every day feeling hungry. Even worse, he had to pay a merit point protection fee to one of the local gangs to be allowed to have a spot to perform divinations. As he thought about all these things, Master God Diviner smiled bitterly. Realizing that he had to accept reality, he sighed and said, "You really think you have it bad? I think you've actually gained some weight since I saw you last." Bai Xiaochun hopped off of the crocodile, which he then sucked into his spirit beast bag. As he stood there with his orange robe and glittering magical treasures, Master God Diviner couldn't help but gasp inwardly. He well knew that to become an orange-robed disciple, one had to pay 100,000 merit points. Plus, a crocodile mount like the one Bai Xiaochun had would cost about the same. After all, Master God Diviner had even enviously passed through the Spirit Beast Pavilion before. "Oh, I have it bad all right," Bai Xiaochun said sadly, "let me tell you. It's been 2 meals now since I've had any precious jade spirit rice, and a whole day since I ran out of 100 flowers spirit alcohol. Plus, I haven't bathed in spirit water for nearly half a day. Look, I even smell a bit sweaty. I can't believe I've gotten so poor." Everything he had just said was true. After all, his life in the East District had been one of luxury and excess. Now that he was in the North District, everything was different, and he couldn't help but feel irritated about that. Master God Diviner's eyes glazed over. The mere words, "precious jade spirit rice," left his heart trembling. Spirit rice like that was something he had only heard about, and had never even been able to smell, let alone taste. It was incredibly expensive, and it had once been his dream to try some. And yet here Bai Xiaochun was saying that he had gone 2 meals without eating any. And then there was 100 flowers spirit alcohol. That sent Master God Diviner even further in the direction of madness. That was the most expensive types of alcohol available in the city, and among his current circle of friends, being able to even drink a mouthful would have made him the subject of envy and jealousy. And yet here Bai Xiaochun was saying that he hadn't had any for a day. That implied that he normally drank it on a daily basis. And when bathing in spirit water was mentioned, tears began to stream down Master God Diviner's face. A mere glance at Bai Xiaochun's skin confirmed that it was glossy and imbued with spiritual energy. That wasn't from his cultivation base, it was caused by the special properties of the spirit water in the Starry Sky Tao Polarity sect. Such water left the body with a layer of natural protection that was mysterious and profound, to say the least. However, such protection was definitely a luxury. If one went for 5 days or more without bathing in spirit water, it would naturally fade away. Master God Diviner stared at Bai Xiaochun, eyes glistening miserably. "Junior Patriarch." Whatever," Bai Xiaochun said, waving his hand in grandly dismissive fashion. "I brought you here with me, didn't I? Therefore, I'm responsible for you. You might have mercilessly dumped me early on, but I'm a magnanimous person. From now on, you stick with me, alright?" Master God Diviner immediately began to tremble. The truth was that he would have stuck with Bai Xiaochun even if Bai Xiaochun tried to drive him away. He had already resolved to swear an oath to follow Bai Xiaochun even if it meant following him into death. "Many thanks, Junior Patriarch." From the excited way he put his banner and table away, it was clear that he felt no attachment to his vendor spot. Hurrying to follow Bai Xiaochun, he said, "So, Junior Patriarch, where are we going?" Bai Xiaochun hesitated for a moment but then decided to simply tell the truth. "Let's go to the spirit bees." However, before he could finish speaking, 3 beams of light sped toward them. Apparently, these 3 people had noticed Master God Diviner getting ready to leave, and were now attempting to intercept him. 3 cultivators landed in front of Master God Diviner, one of them a middle-aged man with a cultivation base in the Great Circle of Foundation establishment. "Leaving early because you got a new customer, Master God Diviner?" he said. "Very well, at least pay your daily fee before leaving." The man's eyes flashed like lightning, and although he wasn't exactly fat, neither was he skinny, and he wore an orange robe just like Bai Xiaochun's. Obviously, he lived a fairly comfortable life here in Sky City. Glancing at Bai Xiaochun, he looked back at Master God Diviner, a false smile stretching out across his face. Master God Diviner's face fell. These 3 were by no means strangers to him, they came from the group that controlled this area. They and a few dozen other cultivators that made up the gang forced all of the vendor stalls in the area to pay a protection fee for the right to do business. Master God Diviner was clearly embarrassed, and didn't want Bai Xiaochun to see him in such a situation. Lowering his voice, he said, "I didn't do any business today. How about tomorrow?" One of the red-robed disciples among the 3 interrupted Master God Diviner and said, "We don't care if you did business or not. The fee is 10 merit points a day. That's what we agreed to, so pay up." Master God Diviner's expression flickered with distress. He knew that Bai Xiaochun, with his gold core cultivation base, wouldn't even bother to spare these 3 a glance. But Master God Diviner still didn't want to lose face in front of Bai Xiaochun. After all, he had been the one to part ways, and if he needed Bai Xiaochun's help in this situation, it would be far too embarrassing. Gritting his teeth, forced a smile onto his face and prepared to pull out his identity medallion. But then, the man in the orange robe said, "Now that you have such a high-class customer, Master God Diviner, I'm afraid the 10 merit point fee won't be enough. We need you to pay for next month in advance." Rage immediately began to flicker in Master God Diviner's eyes. "You people, now, hold that temper of yours. If you don't have enough, I'm sure this new customer of yours wouldn't mind giving you an advance on your services." The orange-robed cultivator looked at Bai Xiaochun with a false smile, his eyes lingering on his numerous glowing magical treasures. Despite his greed, though, he didn't dare to push things too far. He could tell that Bai Xiaochun most likely had an impressive background. However, trying to get a few hundred merit points out of him wouldn't be too excessive. "Junior Patriarch," Master God Diviner said hesitantly. However, Bai Xiaochun waved his hand to cut him off. Eyes shining brightly, he looked over at the orange-robed cultivator. "Well, isn't this interesting? I can't believe I never thought of this myself." The look in Bai Xiaochun's eyes left the orange-robed disciple feeling very unsettled, and the 2 red-robed disciples suddenly had very serious expressions on their faces. "You dare to try to take my money with a foundation establishment cultivation base?" Bai Xiaochun said, "I'm afraid things don't work like that." With that, he threw his head back and began to laugh loudly. The 3 cultivators instantly realized something was wrong, and were just getting ready to attack Bai Xiaochun when he suddenly waved his hand, causing a gale force wind to spring up. Rumbling sounds filled the air, and blood sprayed out of the mouths of the 3 cultivators as they were sent tumbling backward 30 meters. Core formation. Before the 3 of them could stop hurtling through the air, Bai Xiaochun made a grasping motion, turning the wind into bonds that wrapped around them and pulled them toward him. "I have the feeling you people are in need of a good leader. What do you think? Join me, and we can rule everything under heaven." Bai Xiaochun was being very sincere, and in his mind, the grandiose words he had just spoken should definitely cause the 3 men to drop to their knees and kowtow. The 3 of them were trembling, and appeared to be on the verge of weeping. Even Master God Diviner was a bit taken aback. "Don't worry. With me around, nothing bad will happen to you. Come, lead the way to your headquarters so I can meet all the other fellow Taoists in your group." As of this point, he had completely abandoned his plan to sell his crocodile mount. These 3 cultivators had unwittingly opened a door that Bai Xiaochun had never imagined even existed. All of a sudden, he could almost see all the merit points that were waiting for him. In Sky City, the East District had the reputation of being luxurious and extravagant. The North District was more out of the way, and not as well off. Most of the cultivators there were just ordinary people without impressive backgrounds. The Azure Dragon Society had started out relatively unknown in the North District. Considering the impressive name they had picked for their organization, one could well imagine the heroic aspirations of its founders. But ideals don't always measure up to reality. In the 100 years since its founding, they had never grown beyond the small sphere of influence they had started out with on the very edge of the North District. Luckily, the headquarters of the Azure Dragon Society happened to be an immortal's cave, and not a spirit abode. It even had a courtyard with a fountain. Unfortunately, the courtyard was overrun with weeds, and the fountain had long since dried up, but the place was good enough for a small organization like the Azure Dragon Society. The Azure Dragon Society only had about 30 members, and made their living from protection fees and selling spirit medicines that the Starry Sky Tao Polarity sect neither prohibited nor endorsed. Although they couldn't count as being rich, they at least had it better off than average cultivators. Over their 100-year history, 8 of their number had already become yellow-robed disciples. The most successful of all was one of the original founders, who was now in the early gold core stage and lived in the Rainbow District. For old time's sake, and to keep the organization going, he occasionally came back to offer some support and assistance. However, it wasn't a simple thing to return to Sky City, so such visits were somewhat of a rarity. Therefore, the moment Bai Xiaochun walked through the door of the Azure Dragon Society with his gold core cultivation base, he was their new leader. After Bai Xiaochun and Master God Diviner entered the Immortals Cave, booms and bangs began to ring out. Then everything went silent. Moments later, people began to call out greetings. Greetings, boss. Bai Xiaochun sat down proudly in the seat of honor, Master God Diviner standing next to him with a somber expression on his face. Everyone else in the room was bruised and battered as they kowtowed, expressions of fear filling their eyes. With the exception of Bai Xiaochun, everyone present was in the foundation establishment stage. The orange-robed disciples, including the one Bai Xiaochun had met earlier, both had bitter expressions on their faces. Smacking the arm of the chair, Bai Xiaochun raised his voice and said, "We're all brothers here. Don't worry. Now that I'm in charge, we're going to take over Sky City." The 30 members of the Azure Dragon Society exchanged awkward glances, but none of them dared to say a word. To Bai Xiaochun's pleasure, they simply bowed their heads. With that, he toured the Immortals Cave, picking the largest room for himself, where he sat down to practice some cultivation. As time progressed, he was coming to find that he was getting used to the strong spiritual power and energy drainage in the Starry Sky Tao Polarity sect, and because of that, his cultivation speed only continued to increase. For example, his undying tendons were making rapid progress. As for Master God Diviner, he didn't have any feelings toward the Azure Dragon Society, either negative or positive. However, he already felt like he was somewhat in a leadership position, so while Bai Xiaochun was in secluded meditation, he took it upon himself to audit the Azure Dragon Society's account books. He also collected and organized all of the loose merit points. The Azure Dragon Society cultivators weren't happy about that, but didn't dare to say anything. Nor was there anything they could do about it. Bai Xiaochun was a gold core cultivator, and was like an enormous mountain that they could do nothing to contend with. All they could do was accept the situation. In fact, some of them hoped that having a gold core cultivator as their boss might put them on the path to a new and better lifestyle. However, such hopes and dreams gradually faded as time passed. Half a month went by, during which Bai Xiaochun never came out of his room and never did anything. However, considering the income of the Azure Dragon Society, all they had to do was be a bit frugal, and the addition of 2 new members didn't cause much trouble. Unfortunately, Bai Xiaochun did have a very big appetite, and also demanded the best quality food. He even required plenty of spirit water to bathe in every day. Because of that, anger began to fester in the hearts of the Azure Dragon Society. After an entire month went by, even Master God Diviner was reaching the limits of his patience. Since he was in charge of accounts now, he could see with his own eyes that the Azure Dragon Society's merit points were rapidly dwindling. Eventually, Master God Diviner led all of the cultivators to Bai Xiaochun, who was currently in the middle of eating a spirit chicken. Weeping, they began to explain their woes. "Boss, please spare us. Our meager profits aren't enough to fill your appetite, sir. This isn't going to work long-term, boss. With expenses like these, the Azure Dragon Society is going to have to sell our Immortals Cave within a few days at most." Even Master God Diviner chimed in to voice his frustration. Bai Xiaochun immediately felt bad. He had lived so extravagantly in the East District that his current lifestyle seemed like a big step down. However, to others, he seemed to be living in the lap of luxury. Even worse, he had made significant progress in his cultivation of his undying tendons, which caused his energy to be drained at a much higher rate than before. He had tried using some ultra-fasting aid pills, but that could only help on a superficial level. The truth was that he hadn't even realized that he was eating more food than usual. Considering how small the Azure Dragon Society was, he had already emptied their storerooms. The orange-robed cultivator that Bai Xiaochun had met in the very beginning looked tearfully at him and said, "Please, boss, let us off the hook. We've already cut back on food this past month. We increased protection fees and the prices we charge for our fantasy pills, but even with that, we're not making enough money to get enough food to eat." Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat in embarrassment. During his month of secluded meditation, he had completely forgotten about the grand words he had spoken about leading them to take over new territory when he first took over the Azure Dragon Society. "Wait," he said, "what are these fantasy pills you just mentioned, huh?" "Oh, well, fantasy pills are a type of spirit medicine that have gotten popular in the past few years. They don't really do much of anything other than induce hallucinations. Of course, the cultivators who consume them can alter the hallucinations to a certain degree, and thus experience any type of fantasy they wish. The possibilities are endless." Bai Xiaochun immediately demanded to see one of the pills, so the orange-robed cultivator pulled a small wooden box out of his bag of holding and handed it over. Bai Xiaochun accepted the box and opened it. Placed inside was a fingernail-sized black medicinal pill that emanated no medicinal aroma whatsoever. Curious, Bai Xiaochun picked it up to examine it more closely. Master God Diviner leaned over to have a look too. He had heard of the pills, of course, but this was his first time seeing one. Intrigued, Bai Xiaochun used his fingernail to start scraping the black coating off of the pill to see what was inside. The sight of an entire fantasy pill being so casually destroyed caused pain to rise up in the hearts of the rest of the Azure Dragon Society. As Bai Xiaochun scratched the coating off, his expression changed from one of curiosity into surprise. Then his eyes widened. After piercing through the black coating, a wisp of gray smoke began to swirl out from inside. Upon seeing the smoke, Bai Xiaochun gasped, and Master God Diviner cried out, "Junior Patriarch, is that your hallucination smoke?" The Azure Dragon Society cultivators' jaws dropped, although they really had no idea what Master God Diviner was talking about. A grim expression appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face as he reached out and grabbed the strand of gray smoke. After examining it closely, he was absolutely certain that this so-called fantasy pill was concocted from the very same hallucination smoke that he had accidentally created when concocting pills back in the Bloodstream sect. During the Great War of the Four Sects, he had altered the formula using the powers of gravity and repulsion, and then used it to create weapons for his compatriots to use. How could he ever have imagined that he would actually find that same medicine so far away in the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect? Clearly, someone had acquired one of his hallucination spheres and then altered the formula, reducing the hallucinatory effects and also changing it so that whoever took the pill could control the hallucination to some extent and become lost in a wonderful world of their own making. Considering that Bai Xiaochun was an expert in the Tao of medicine, it only took a moment for him to understand everything that had happened. However, the changes to the medicinal pill were crude at best, and Bai Xiaochun could tell that they could lead to dangerous side effects. In the end, though, the fact that this pill had been created using his own hallucination smoke left Bai Xiaochun feeling very angry. "To take without asking is robbery," he said through gritted teeth. Eyes flashing with anger, he looked at the Azure Dragon Society. Where did this fantasy pill come from? The Azure Dragon Society's two orange-robed cultivators could tell that something was off. The expressions on the faces of Bai Xiaochun and Master God Diviner were very telling, and they could only guess that some unimaginable turn of events had occurred. However, they didn't dare to keep any secrets. "From the Celestial Sky Society." "Yeah, the Celestial Sky Society is the biggest organization in Sky City. They have connections to all the businesses in the city, and they also control the city's underworld. They're the ones who distribute the fantasy pills. We smaller organizations just resell them for a small profit." The Celestial Sky Society again. Bai Xiaochun's eyes flickered with icy coldness. Clenching his hand into a fist around the black medicinal powder in his palm, he looked around at the Azure Dragon Society cultivators and said, "How well do the fantasy pills sell?" The two orange-robed cultivators were panting, and their eyes were shining brightly. One of them quickly responded, "They sell great. We usually distribute a few hundred pills per month, and that's just us. If you counted all of the North District, the sales would probably be tens of thousands per month. As for Sky City as a whole, probably 200,000 or more. One fantasy pill is worth 50 merit points, so that's the equivalent of at least 10 million merit points per month." When Bai Xiaochun heard that, his eyes almost turned green, and he began to pant. "If the Celestial Sky Society can use my hallucination smoke to earn merit points, then so can I. All of you, wait here for me. I'll concoct some high-quality fantasy pills for you to sell. With that, he rushed into his room and slammed the door behind him. The Azure Dragon Society members looked over at Master God Diviner, hearts filled with curiosity over what was to come. Master God Diviner, is it true that our boss really invented the fantasy pill? Is our boss really an apothecary? Can he really concoct fantasy pills? Heavens! If that's true, then good times are definitely to come. Master God Diviner was more excited than anyone, but he didn't let it show on his face. Looking around, he smiled faintly, and then gave a confident nod. Don't you worry, he said. I can't speak for the boss when it comes to other matters, but I can tell you that my junior patriarch is the best there is at medicine concocting. When the Azure Dragon Society heard that, their anticipation grew, and it was almost possible to see them calculating their future profits. As soon as Bai Xiaochun entered his room, he waved his hand, summoning several dozen pill furnaces from his bag of holding. These were furnaces that he had collected back in the river-defying sect, and were all different sizes and shapes. Considering how familiar he was with the hallucination smoke, he didn't plan to produce just one batch of fantasy pills at a time. He was going to concoct multiple batches simultaneously. The main thing he was concerned about was maintaining a standard of quality. After all, these pills weren't designed to be used in war, so he needed to control the hallucinatory effects. And that meant he had to control the strength of the pills. Of course, Bai Xiaochun had invented the hallucination smoke to begin with, so his ability to do that vastly exceeded that of the Celestial Sky Society's apothecary. He was completely confident that he would be able to concoct fantasy pills that were on a whole different level than the trash produced by the Celestial Sky Society. In terms of how to actually contain the hallucination smoke, the black coating on the Celestial Sky Society's fantasy pills had given him a bit of inspiration. After studying it a bit, he improved it, and then managed to actually fuse the smoke itself with the coating. Time passed, and outside, the Azure Dragon Society waited in eager anticipation. 3 days later, Bai Xiaochun emerged, eyes bloodshot but shining with excitement. Waving his sleeve, he sent out countless violet medicinal pills from his bag of holding. As they piled up on the ground, they formed a small mountain of more than 1,000 pills. The Azure Dragon Society members were shaking with excitement. Then, one of the cultivators clasped hands and bowed to Bai Xiaochun, hurried forward and carefully picked up one of the pills. After placing it into his mouth, he closed his eyes, and within moments, a look of intoxicated pleasure appeared on his face. Throwing his head back, he howled with complete and utter madness. Clearly, he was experiencing no side effects. As for the other cultivators, they knew that an important test was being performed, so they watched closely. After the time it takes an incense stick to burn, the cultivator still hadn't woken up from his reverie, and everyone else started to get very excited. The Celestial Sky Society's fantasy pill lasts for the time it takes an incense stick to burn, but Boss's pill lasts for even longer than that, and from the look of it, there are no harmful side effects whatsoever. Even as the Azure Dragon Society devolved into a hubbub, another incense stick's worth of time passed. Only then did the cultivator's eyes open. Although he seemed to be in a bit of a daze, he was clearly satisfied in an unprecedented way. After a long moment passed, he regained his senses. Trembling, he said, the hallucination was much more realistic than the fantasy pills from the Celestial Sky Society. And easier to manipulate. In fact, after a certain point, I completely lost myself. I didn't need to control the hallucination at all, it did everything I wanted. How pure, how unadulterated. This is what a fantasy pill is supposed to be like. The rest of the Azure Dragon Society grew even more excited. Panting, the cultivators looked at the pile of fantasy pills and realized that it was essentially a huge pile of merit points. One of the orange-robed cultivators excitedly said, "Boss, if you let us sell these fantasy pills, we can clear the stock in 2 months at the most." As of this moment, Bai Xiaochun truly was like nobility to these cultivators, a grand figure who existed on a different level than them. Bai Xiaochun was tired, but looked excited, and was clearly pleased with the quality of the fantasy pills he had concocted. Looking at Master God Diviner, he said, "For now, steer clear of the Celestial Sky Society. When the time comes to butt heads with them, I don't just want a little scuffle." Master God Diviner saw the gleam in Bai Xiaochun's eyes, and after a moment of thought, nodded. In recent days, he had made some inquiries of his own, and had heard stories of Apothecary Bai from the East District, and the methods the Celestial Sky Society had used in dealing with his ultra-fasting aid pill. His information had left him 90% that Bai Xiaochun and Apothecary Bai were one and the same. As of now, he was completely convinced, and also understood why Bai Xiaochun had disguised his appearance. In fact, he still hadn't even revealed his name to the Azure Dragon Society. Celestial Sky Society. Master God Diviner thought, his eyes narrowing. Almost immediately, countless nefarious plans sprang up in his mind, which he began to explain to the rest of the Azure Dragon Society. Bai Xiaochun remained off to the side, completely satisfied with Master God Diviner's performance. With Master God Diviner at his side, he didn't feel like a lone wolf anymore. At this point, he suddenly thought about Shu Baosai and the others. If only the rest of you merciless betrayers could turn over a new leaf. I can't believe you just abandoned me. Depressed, he went back to his room to practice cultivation. After Master God Diviner finished explaining all of his plans, the Azure Dragon Society went to work. They even got their friends and family involved in selling the fantasy pills. Considering that the Azure Dragon Society had been around for more than 100 years, they had good relations with many of the other small organizations in the North District. As such, the fantasy pill sales started out with a bang. Most of the merit points they earned were spent on recruitment efforts. Life was hard in Sky City, so as long as enough merit points were offered, there would be no shortage of people willing to join up. Bai Xiaochun had plenty to keep him busy. To keep up with demand, he had to concoct more and more fantasy pills, until he was concocting them in batches of 50 at a time. With the fantasy pills to support them, the Azure Dragon Society was able to fully call upon its 100 years of connections and history. With the help of Master God Diviner's plans and schemes, their numbers grew in shockingly rapid fashion. As their territory expanded, cultivators came constantly, hoping to join. Fantasy pill sales skyrocketed, until all of the North District was shaken. Because of how Vice Boss Master God Diviner had arranged everything, the Celestial Sky Society still hadn't noticed what was happening. Although only half a month had passed so far, that half month had seen heaven shaking, earth toppling changes for the Azure Dragon Society. Eventually, the Celestial Sky Society finally took note of what was happening. 10 days after that, it had been a full month since the Azure Dragon Society began their big expansion. They had reinvested all of the merit points into their growth plans, and Bai Xiaochun had even decided to go all in by selling his crocodile mount to help out. By that point, the Azure Dragon Society had over 1,000 members. In Sky City, that didn't really count as anything amazing in terms of membership, but it was big enough that it was a cause for concern for the Celestial Sky Society. Unfortunately, the Azure Dragon Society was large enough now that using force on them wasn't an option. If any fighting broke out, they might end up breaking the rules of the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect. Not even the Celestial Sky Society dared to push things too far when it came to the official rules of the sect. Bai Xiaochun was getting better and better at concocting the fantasy pills. In fact, sometimes he just set the pill furnaces up and then had Master God Diviner watch over them until they were ready to be completed. With more spare time on his hands, Bai Xiaochun was able to focus more easily on cultivation. At the same time, he had returned to his previous extravagant lifestyle. However, he no longer ate the precious jade spirit rice. Instead, he favored Heavenspan spirit rice, which was prepared by a special method using Heavenspan river water. It was the same with the alcohol, he only consumed the best. He had a new mount, too, a blue-eyed Qilin lizard. Whenever he went out on that mount, flanked by 100 followers, he made a very impressive sight. Time passed. 2 more months went by, and not only did the Azure Dragon Society continue to grow, they had expanded their influence into 3 of the other districts, ensuring that their fantasy pill sales only continued to increase. Simultaneously, the Celestial Sky Society's fantasy pill sales were dropping significantly. After all, the 2 pills were on completely different levels. Bai Xiaochun's life was getting better and better. Things here are so expensive. That was Bai Xiaochun a year ago, when he first arrived in Sky City. Hey, this looks pretty nice. It's a bit expensive but, whatever, I'll just grin and bear it. That was Bai Xiaochun during his days profiting from the ultra-fasting aid pills. This looks great, I'll take it. That was Bai Xiaochun when the Azure Dragon Society was beginning to rise to prominence in the North District. And now, currently, Bai Xiaochun was in the Magic Pavilion, looking at about 100 magical items on display. Sounding very pleased with himself, he began to point at some of the objects. This one, that one, oh, that one too. Those are the 3 I don't want. I'll take everything else. The shop attendants were sweating, and their hearts pounding at having such a rich and important person to deal with. Bai Xiaochun really couldn't help but live so extravagantly. Whether it was in terms of food, clothing, or anything else, he only got the best. If you added up the value of everything he was currently wearing, it would be valued at something around 7-800,000 merit points. In fact, if he wanted to be promoted to the Rainbow District, it would be a very simple thing. But Bai Xiaochun couldn't bear to leave Sky City, and was convinced that life on the rainbow definitely wouldn't be as nice. In fact, he had even made some inquiries, and had been informed that his suspicions were correct. Nobody on the rainbow lived like he did now. Therefore, he had made up his mind to spend the rest of his time as a hostage in Sky City. Only an idiot would go to that rainbow, he thought, humming a little tune as he swaggered through the crowd. When people in the North District caught sight of him, expressions of both envy and respect could be seen in their eyes. He was beside himself with delight, and couldn't stop thinking about how outstanding he was. Everywhere he went, he ended up being the center of attention. The truth was, he didn't really care much about the money, and didn't even pay much attention to how much the Azure Dragon Society was saving up. As long as there were enough merit points to keep the Azure Dragon Society running, he didn't care. However, there were a few aspects to his wonderful life that he wasn't too pleased about. Because the Azure Dragon Society had expanded so quickly, their new recruits were a mix of good and bad. Other organizations within Sky City had sent people to infiltrate them, and that was especially true of the Celestial Sky Society. Furthermore, as the Azure Dragon Society expanded into the other 3 districts, rumors began to spread. Some rumors claimed that Bai Xiaochun was none other than the apothecary Bai from the East District. Others focused on how wicked and violent the Azure Dragon Society was. The third type of common rumor focused on how harmful and addictive the fantasy pills supposedly were. In the end, virtually all of the rumors were about the Azure Dragon Society and Bai Xiaochun, like a wide net slowly being stretched out over the both of them. Master God Diviner quickly caught on to this. Other than the first small group of cultivators who had made up the original Azure Dragon Society, few people ever saw him. He was Bai Xiaochun's trusted advisor who lurked in the shadows, unseen by the public. When Bai Xiaochun got Master God Diviner's report about the rumors, he took it very seriously. He was well aware of the devious ways of the Celestial Sky Society, and could well imagine that their lack of action during the past few months was because they were waiting for the right moment to deliver a fatal blow. Considering how seriously Bai Xiaochun took the matter, Master God Diviner did so as well. He quickly mobilized all of the Azure Dragon Society to try to counteract the rumors. Unfortunately, their work did little to quell the gossip, and in fact, it grew even worse. One evening, Bai Xiaochun was enjoying his evening meal, an exotic spread of the finest delicacies piled up as high as mountains, with 2 lovely female cultivators there to serve him. Master God Diviner also sat at the table, providing his usual daily report regarding the affairs of the Azure Dragon Society. That was when the news came in. Boss, the investigations we started running a few days ago identified one of the main sources of the rumors. We captured him and brought him in, and now we just need you to come decide what to do, boss. Bai Xiaochun grunted in acknowledgement as he continued to munch on the chicken leg he had just picked up. Master God Diviner smacked his hand down onto the table and gave a cold harumph. Bring him here. Let's see who it is that had the gall to stir up trouble for us. Before long, shrill shrieks of terror could be heard, drawing closer and closer to the room where Bai Xiaochun and Master God Diviner were eating dinner. Fellow Taoists of the Azure Dragon Society, spare me. I'm sorry. Really, I'm truly sorry. The shrieking grew louder and louder as 2 burly Azure Dragon Society cultivators dragged a young man with disheveled hair into the room. The young man didn't struggle at all as the 2 burly cultivators forced him onto his knees. Not daring to look up, he continued to whimper and cry for mercy. Spare me, Boss Azure Dragon. I'm sorry, sir, really, I won't ever dare to do it again. I was a fool to work for the Celestial Sky Society. Please, forgive me, Boss Azure Dragon. The young man's wails were truly inspiring of pity. However, as the young man prattled on, Bai Xiaochun stopped gnawing on the chicken leg and looked closer at him. Next to him, Master God Diviner's eyes widened. Then, the 2 of them exchanged a glance. Both of them had simultaneously realized that, unexpectedly, the young cultivator begging for mercy was Xu Baosai. He had been beaten up, his nose swollen and his hair completely disheveled. His voice was hoarse, and he still hadn't even dared to lift his head. A strange expression appeared on Bai Xiaochun's face. Clearing his throat, he finished the chicken leg and then suddenly yelled, Xu Baosai. Xu Baosai had been kneeling there with his head bowed. In response to Bai Xiaochun's sudden outburst, he screamed and prepared to continue begging for mercy. However, the voice from just now seemed very familiar, and without even thinking about it, he looked up, to find an unfamiliar face behind the mounds of exquisite delicacies on the table. The other face at the table was not unfamiliar, though. Shocked, he realized that the second person sitting there was Master God Diviner. Shu Baosai's jaw dropped, and a blank expression filled his eyes. In that moment, the unfamiliar face suddenly blurred, and then, he was looking at a face that was anything but unfamiliar. Shu Baosai's mind was spinning, and a look of complete and utter incredulity could be seen on his face. "Bai," he shrieked. However, before he could finish his sentence, a chicken leg shot through the air and entered his mouth. Coughing dryly, Bai Xiaochun smiled and said, "How did you get yourself in such a bad situation, Shu Baosai? I mean, I thought I had it bad, but obviously, you have it way worse than me." After seeing Bai Xiaochun's reaction, the two men holding Shu Baosai released him. Aware that some things weren't meant for their ears, they quickly departed. Shu Baosai's eyes were completely bloodshot from crying. As he looked at Bai Xiaochun with his glittering magical treasures, his face glowing with health, his table full of spirit food, Shu Baosai began to pant. The combined value of all of that wasn't quite enough to rise to the yellow-robed disciple level, but it was very close. In sharp contrast, the income he made from selling information couldn't reach that level in a 60-year cycle. Furthermore, the fact that Bai Xiaochun was now boss Azure Dragon was completely mind-blowing, to the point where tears began to leak out of his eyes. In addition to all that, the two women waiting upon Bai Xiaochun weren't actual people, they were ingeniously crafted puppets. Shu Baosai trembled at that. Such lifelike puppets were astronomically expensive. Shu Baosai also couldn't help but notice all of the glittering magical treasures that Master God Diviner was wearing, and how his cultivation base fluctuations were clearly at a higher level than the last time they had met. Much to Shu Baosai's bitterness, Master God Diviner was obviously getting very close to core formation. By now, he was filled with deep and utter regret regarding his earlier decision to leave the group. As he thought back to the rough and bitter days he had experienced trying to gather and sell information, he almost couldn't believe he had been so arrogant. Furthermore, how could he have missed the fact that Bai Xiaochun had become the boss of the Azure Dragon Society? The mere thought of how leaving Bai Xiaochun had caused him to lose out on this incredible opportunity left him extremely bitter. "Junior Patriarch, I really messed up," he said, staring up piteously at Bai Xiaochun. As of this moment, he had decided in his heart that he would stick with Bai Xiaochun no matter what, even if he tried to drive him away. Whatever," Bai Xiaochun said, waving his hand in grandly dismissive fashion. "I brought you here with me, didn't I? Therefore, I'm responsible for you. You might have mercilessly dumped me early on, but I'm a magnanimous person. From now on, you stick with me, alright?" Tears of gratitude immediately began to pour down Shu Baosai's face. As for Master God Diviner, he cleared his throat awkwardly. After all, the words Bai Xiaochun had just uttered sounded quite familiar to him. "It's getting late," Bai Xiaochun said, "so why don't you go rest up? Tomorrow we can reminisce a bit about old times." Having finished eating, Bai Xiaochun waved his hand, and one of the serving girls came over to wipe his mouth with a handkerchief. Sighing, he stuck his chin up and looked at the girl, then said, "Let's go. Carry me over to my pill concocting station." The two serving girls picked Bai Xiaochun up and floated away. He didn't even need to walk at this point. Master God Diviner quickly rose to his feet, clasped hands, and bowed. Then, in a voice which sounded well rehearsed, said, "Farewell, my lord." This display left Shu Baosai shocked into stupefaction. How could he ever have imagined that life could be lived in such a way? "I want to live like this too," Shu Baosai wailed inwardly as he watched Bai Xiaochun leave. A moment later, Master God Diviner rose from his bow, cleared his throat, and said, "Brother Shu, it's been a few months. How did you end up in such a bad situation?" Shu Baosai's wrath was immediately aroused. After all, it had been the goading of Master God Diviner that had convinced him to leave Bai Xiaochun to begin with. However, he knew that now was not the time to give voice to his anger. All he could do was put a bitter expression on his face and curse Master God Diviner inwardly. Master God Diviner actually felt a bit bad. Sighing, he said, "Don't blame me for all this. Even I had no idea that our junior patriarch would rise to such shocking heights. In Sky City, not everything depends on cultivation base, you know." With that, Master God Diviner arranged for a place for Shu Baosai to stay, and even gave him some merit points as pocket money. As Master God Diviner led Shu Baosai to his new accommodations, Shu Baosai came to realize that Master God Diviner also occupied a lofty position within the Azure Dragon Society. All the cultivators in the Immortals cave who saw him gazed upon him with expressions of deep respect. Shu Baosai was starting to get more and more excited. That night, he found it hard to sleep. The next morning at dawn, he walked bleary-eyed out of his room, uttering another oath under his breath. "I have to become more important to the junior patriarch than Master God Diviner is." With Shu Baosai back, Bai Xiaochun now had one more of his original group of Dao protectors. Xu Baosai immediately began to go above and beyond the call of duty when it came to his work, gathering information and propagating rumors. Under his direction, the Azure Dragon Society wasn't just able to quell some of the bad rumors being spread about them, they were actually able to fight back with increasing effectiveness. Xu Baosai was going all out, using every trick in his book to achieve the best results possible. Bai Xiaochun had plenty of spare time on his hands. Master God Diviner took care of day-to-day operations, Xu Baosai was responsible for handling intelligence, and they had a few dozen orange-robed disciples to act as sub-bosses. The Azure Dragon Society was growing more and more stable. Their expansion hadn't slowed in the least, and in fact, they were still growing. As a result, their fantasy pill business grew with shocking speed. The Celestial Sky Society had been doing plenty of plotting and scheming, but it did little good. They were very capable of handling problems with individuals, but when it came to other large organizations in the city, they fell short. The rise of the Azure Dragon Society had come too quickly and unexpectedly, and because of that, the Celestial Sky Society was completely incapable of dealing with them. The matter with the rumors had been one part of their initial plan, and although it had started out well, in the end, it fell flat. As their other strategies failed, the Celestial Sky Society grew increasingly enraged by the Azure Dragon Society. One reason was that everything they did had to be accomplished from the shadows. Eventually, their research into the fantasy pill revealed that the boss of the Azure Dragon Society was none other than the very same apothecary Bai who had created the ultra-fasting aid pill. Unfortunately, when they tried to investigate Bai Xiaochun's past, they came up with nothing. Not even their agents in the Azure Dragon Society itself could come up with any information. Apparently, very few people within the Azure Dragon Society even knew the level of his cultivation base. Thanks to the training provided by Master God Diviner, the original members who did know a bit about Bai Xiaochun were circumspect and kept their information to themselves. Although the Celestial Sky Society was a bit apprehensive that Bai Xiaochun seemed to have come out of nowhere, it wasn't completely unheard of for people in the Starry Sky Dao Polarity sect to be so secretive. As far as looking into the origins of the fantasy pill, it might have seemed like a good idea, but the truth was that they had come across the pill completely by accident, and had no idea where it came from. Besides, the Eastern cultivation world was a huge place, and the things that went on in the lower reaches were of little interest to people upriver. As the days marched by, the Celestial Sky Society watched the Azure Dragon Society growing larger and larger. Eventually, the Azure Dragon Society's fantasy pill sales surpassed the Celestial Sky Society's, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The Celestial Sky Society's headquarters was in the central district of Sky City, and currently, a meeting was going on there to try to decide what to do about the Azure Dragon Society. Some were in favor of continued plotting and scheming, with the eventual goal of breaking the Azure Dragon Society apart. However, a plan like that would take some time to be effective. At one point in the meeting, a cold snort echoed out. "We can't wait any longer. It's not that our Celestial Sky Society can't use force to solve the problem, it's that we can't afford to break any rules. These people from the Azure Dragon Society are just too stubborn. Look, what's the point of having endless meetings about this? Have you people forgotten how powerful the Celestial Sky Society is? Let's just go kidnap that apothecary Bai." "But we don't know the level of his cultivation base," someone protested. "Without that bit of knowledge, trying to do something like that, there are plenty of things under heaven that we don't know. Is that a good reason to just back down? No matter how impressive his background, can he match up to the Celestial Sky Society? We come from a diva clan. As for his cultivation base, there's no way he's a nascent soul expert. It's even highly unlikely that he's at core formation. If he were, why wouldn't he have been promoted to the Rainbow District? Why would he waste his time here concocting medicine?" The person making these arguments had a relatively high position in the organization, and as such, no one was willing to go against him. Although most of them weren't quite convinced that it was a good idea, they merely exchanged glances and then held their tongues. Soon, the Celestial Sky Society was stirring. They didn't have any core formation cultivators, only people in the great circle of the foundation establishment stage, and a few quasi-core stage experts. After all, there were only red and orange-robed disciples in their organization. Those who had reached the yellow-robed level had already left, and couldn't easily be called back. In order to handle Bai Xiaochun, they gathered 10 quasi-core cultivators, as well as a few dozen in the great circle of foundation establishment, plus even more who were in late foundation establishment. After night fell, they headed straight into the North District, toward the Immortals Cave that was the headquarters of the Azure Dragon Society. A group that powerful was strong enough to dominate any other organization in the entire city. They didn't hold anything back in terms of speed. After all, this was a surprise attack, and the success of their plan hinged on clinching victory in the first move. Although the main plan was to kidnap him, if worse came to worst, they were also prepared to kill him and deal with the consequences later. It was a dark and windy night, and Bai Xiaochun was just preparing to settle down cross-legged to start cultivating his frigid school will evolving incantation. After all of his recent cultivation, he was nearing the peak of the frigid acolyte level. The frigid chi which swirled around him would be shocking to anyone who could see it, and caused layers of frost to slowly cake the walls of the room. Thankfully, his cultivation was mostly focused inwardly, because such intensely frigid chi could freeze even foundation establishment cultivators to death. He had just settled his chi and cleared his mind when, all of a sudden, his eyes widened. Looking up, a strange expression appeared on his face. But then, he merely cleared his throat and then closed his eyes to meditate. Meanwhile, numerous shadowy figures were approaching the Immortals' cave. After exchanging glances, they charged forward, which caused the Azure Dragon Society's defensive spell formation to spring up. Immediately following that, thunderous booms filled the air as the Celestial Sky Society cultivators unleashed all of their most powerful attacks, blasting the spell formation shield to pieces. The Azure Dragon Society responded immediately, the cultivators inside shouting at the tops of their lungs and unleashing magical techniques in all directions. Beat it. But then the 10 quasi-core cultivators waded into the fight, and no matter how well prepared the Azure Dragon Society cultivators were, they couldn't deal with such power. They were immediately put on the defensive. By this point, the sub-bosses of the Azure Dragon Society realized what kind of people they were fighting. Quasi-core stage. Gasps rang out as the 10 quasi-core cultivators stomped everything in their path as easily as dried weeds. In almost the exact same instant, the spies that had infiltrated the Azure Dragon Society appeared. Boss, Azure Dragon's room is right there. Arrogant expressions could be seen on the faces of the 10 quasi-core cultivators as they shot toward Bai Xiaochun's room. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together, and it was with complete disdain that they crashed into his room. As for the other 4, they remained outside to prevent anyone from entering. After tonight, the Azure Dragon Society won't have any boss at all, one of the quasi-core cultivators said loftily. The Azure Dragon Society cultivators were getting very nervous, and the cultivators from the Celestial Sky Society were chuckling coldly, convinced that their mission had been accomplished, and that once a boom rang out from that room, they could flee. However, instead of a boom, their ears were met with silence. After the 6 quasi-core cultivators charged into his room, no sounds of combat emerged. It was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Expressions of shock began to appear on the faces of everyone in the crowd, with the exception of Master God Diviner and Shu Baosai, who were looking on with disdain. What happened? Someone whispered. Something definitely seemed off about the situation. The door to the room looked like a black mouth ready to swallow up anyone who entered it. Many people present felt chills running down their spine just at the sight of it. The 4 quasi-core cultivators exchanged glances, and then gritted their teeth to take action. They couldn't just leave now and return with no information to report. Joining their power together, they moved to enter the room. However, before they could reach the door, a blast of frigid chi erupted from the room, filling the area. As the frigid chi filled them, it felt like they were being frozen in place, causing their eyes to go wide with disbelief. One of the quasi-core cultivators suddenly began to emit red light as he burned a paper talisman in defense. With the power of the flames assisting him, he managed to stagger backward a few paces, his face ashen. Eyes wide with shock and terror, he cried, "Core formation."